What's going on, guys? Jordan here at Totally Bored, and today I'm reviewing Expeditions, a game designed by Jamie Stegmaier, published by Stonemaier Games. And for full transparency, I did receive this as a review copy.
In Expeditions, Siberia has been hit with a massive meteorite, awakening an ancient corruption that is spreading throughout the land. Embark on your journey for glory with your own unique character, companion, and mech as you explore new lands, search for artifacts, and complete quests along your way.
Now, in this review, I'll be looking at four main elements: the theme, the gameplay, the value, and then my final impressions. All right, so this is a very top-down overview of how Expeditions works. So in this game, you are working to complete 4 objectives. And now these objectives range from things like completing quests, from upgrading your mech, as well as even having 5 maps in your possession. Now on your turn at the beginning of the game, you're gonna have access to all 3 of your actions. You have move, you have play, and you have gather. And you can do these in any order that you want. So let's say on my first turn as Anna here and as Tatanka the mech, I will first move over to the sawmill. You can move up to 3 hexes or 4 if you're one of the mechs. But let's say I move here to the sawmill. Now I want to gather the resources at this location. And I'm going to gather one of these red workers here, which I already have on my board actually. And then now I can play a card. And let's see, I can play Anna here. And when I play this card, I'm going to get the core value, which is the value on the top left. So she's going to gain me 1 power. And if I want, I can spend a worker of the matching color to perform an effect on that card. And with Anna, she allows me to gain a face-up quest on the board. So let's see, we have Banish the Squatters here. This is a cool card. And so whenever I take a card, I'll put it into my active row, which is essentially your discard pile. And then it is the other player's turn. Now, when it comes back to your turn, you now have a little action selection puzzle. So you have to shift this cube up, and you have to decide which action do you not want to take. So let's say I really want another worker, but I also need to move over to a different hex for my next turn. So I might shift this up and cover up the play action. Now this lets me gather and move. Let's say I gather another red worker here, and then I am going to move over to the secret facility. Then it goes to the next player's turn, and that's really how the core game works. If at any point you really want to take all 3 actions, or you want to take all of the cards in your active row and put them back into your hand, you can refresh your turn, which ultimately means you skip your turn and you move this cube down. So on the following turn, you will gain all 3 actions again. Now, at any point that you're able to complete one of your objectives, you actually have to take a specific action called the boast action, represented by this star here, in order to turn in that quest, essentially. So let's say I have 5 maps available, and I'm able to complete this objective here. What I would want to do is, on my turn, I would want to make sure I can move and gather, or unless I'm already there, make sure I can gather. And I would move here, gather the boast action, or perform the boast action, and with my 5 maps I do meet that criteria, and I would place one of my glory tokens on that objective. This continues until one person places their last glory token on the board, and then every single person gets 1 more turn, including the player who placed that token. Now, first up we have the theme, and looking at this game from an artistic or aesthetic point of view, it is gorgeous. I mean, I'm for real, this is probably one of the most beautiful games I have in my collection. The 1920s plus universe created by the artist Jacob Rosalski is just super captivating. I love everything about it, so very, very high marks when it comes to the art and aesthetic. Now, when it comes to components, looking at the cards and the thick hexes, I think there's no issue here. Nothing really stands out in that regard, but I will say the mechs are beautiful. I think they're very creative and well made, super highly detailed. I personally really like Lumberjack, who has these saws for hands and he can go through and cut down trees. Very, very cool, but component-wise, not crazy great, but also not bad, so no real things to note here. And next up we have the story. So in Expeditions, this takes place after the war in Scythe, and there are meteorites that are crashing down, causing corruption that's spreading throughout the land. there are humans that are possessed as well as animals, and you're trying to go explore what's happening. You're looking for artifacts, you're trying to complete quests, and overall achieve glory. Now, looking at the theme as a whole, this game gets very high marks for the art and aesthetic. This is obviously subjective, but this is just about everything I want in a game as far as visually. Absolutely love the art. The story doesn't really shine through to me. If they came out with some kind of campaign, that could change, but as it sits right now, it's not very strong. It doesn't always feel thematic. There are meeples, for example. I think there's 5 different kinds, and there's technically different kinds like soldiers, like villagers, I believe, possessed, all kinds of different ones, but ultimately while you're playing, it doesn't really feel like you are utilizing that kind of worker. It's really just get the worker of that type and play the card. So not too much to say there, but I will say the theme doesn't always pull through. All right, so looking at the gameplay of Expedition. So we have a lot of different game mechanisms in here. So the main ones are gonna be action selection, you have some resource management, and then mostly you're gonna be doing a fusion of deck building and tableau building. Now, I personally love every mechanism in this game, so I really enjoy it. I personally love deck builders and tableau builders. I do enjoy like Terraforming Mars, Ares Expedition, things like that. And this really does create kind of a unique spin on both. Like I mentioned before, you have a hand, but it's really not your hand. It's on the table next to your mech mat. And then you have what's considered an active row, which is basically your discard pile. So everything's visible and kind of creates that tableau, but mechanically, it sort of works like a deck builder where you get a card, when you play it, you shift it over to the active row, and then eventually you can bring them back into your hand, which works very similar to a deck builder. Now, looking at the player interaction in this game, I think there is not a ton. Now, there is some indirect interaction as far as blocking out locations against your opponent, but overall, I would say this is mostly a heads down experience. Now, a little bit about me, I do like player interaction, but I also really do enjoy that parallel play, so I'm not too worried if it has a ton of direct player interaction myself. Now, when it comes to pace and duration, I played this game 5 times, and all of them but one have taken under an hour and a half, which is actually right on the money according to the box. When I had my 4-player game, I was teaching 3 new people, and it took around 2.5 hours. Now, turns in this game are super snappy. I feel like there's very little downtime, which I personally like that. And so this is getting definitely good marks in the pace duration. I think the time is fairly accurate. When you're playing at the larger player counts, I have not played this at 5, but I have played it at 4. It will take longer, obviously, especially if you're teaching new people, but it's still fast, and you have just enough time to think about what you're gonna do, and by the time you do, it's your turn. So I really enjoy that about Expeditions. Next up, we have the value, and the first thing I look at is the replayability. That's a huge factor for me in games, and in Expeditions, there's a lot of it. So you will be shuffling all of the locations, the south, the central, and the northern locations, so you have a different layout of the game every single time. You also are supposed to, according to the rules, randomize the mech mat as well as the character card that you receive. So that right there is also a ton of replayability. I think at each player count you play this at, it feels wildly different as well. I played this solo, 2 players, and 4 players. So I've not played it at 3 and not at 5, but I do have a pretty good gauge of how those would operate, and they're very different. I mean, solo, you have 2 different automa mechs that are moving around the map, blocking spaces and doing other actions. And so it feels pretty tight. I mean, you do have the freedom and flexibility to go mostly where you want to. And at a 2-player game, it's also similar. I like that open-endedness of it. It doesn't feel too restrictive. When I played it 4-player, it felt more restrictive. Obviously, there's a lot more people on the map, and so you have to kind of strategize where you want to go and then really be open to changing your strategy, because people are going to block exactly where you want to go, like every time. So I think it's very unique, and I like that about the game. It's not a bad thing that it feels different at those different player counts, and it really only adds to the replayability. Next up, we have accessibility, and Expeditions gets very high marks in that as well. This is technically a medium weight Euro, and I do agree with that, but you're taking 2 to 3 actions on your turn, so it's really easy to wrap your head around. I taught this to 3 new players, and after 1 round, everything was moving along very smoothly, and there were very little questions. The main thing is there is a lot of iconography, so those player aids come in handy for sure. I definitely recommend using that, especially when you're teaching new players. Now, probably the biggest thing to consider is this game worth the money? And its current MSRP is listed at $85. You're rarely gonna find it that expensive, but if I'm looking at the MSRP, I can go ahead and say, I don't think it's worth $85. That's a lot of money for what you get in the box itself. Now, there is a lot of replayability, but you can go play a Uno and get a lot of replayability. So objectively speaking, I think it's too much money. But if you're able to find this on sale, if it's like around $60, I absolutely think this is worth it. You get a ton of content, a lot of replayability, and overall a really, really fun, unique experience that's very accessible to a lot of people. Now let's talk about what I think about this game, starting with the pros. So as far as mechanisms go, I legit love everything in this game. I like the engine building, the action selection, a little bit of resource management with the power and the guile, that fusion between deck building and tableau building. It all comes together and feels so engaging, so fun, so rewarding. I really, really enjoy it. Being able to chain together combos and making turns last as long as humanly possible just to piss off your friends, there's really nothing better than that. I also love how fast and snappy the turns are in this game. Very, very little downtime. I feel like the playtime is accurate, so that gets high marks in my book. And I really, really like the amount of paths to victory there are in this game. I'm personally not a fan of really, really restrictive, tight games, and this feels the exact opposite. It feels very open-ended, lots of different ways you can try to achieve victory, and I like that a lot. I don't feel like I'm too scrunched together. You know, when you're playing at higher player counts, you feel that a bit more as far as when people are blocking spaces, but it never feels bad enough to where it's just not enjoyable. And then finally, I think the game is beautiful. Like I mentioned already, aesthetically speaking, I love it. The board is super unique. I love setting it up. It just feels really cool, and I like that about this game a lot. Now let's talk about the cons. So I have a few of them. The biggest one is the price. At $85 MSRP, that is just too much money for what you're getting in this box. Now, if you can find it for like around $60, I think it's a great purchase. But at $85, I would not personally pay that much for this. I also think thematically, some of the things in this game don't always shine through. One of them is the workers, like I mentioned already. They don't really feel too unique or distinct. I want to feel like there's more of a difference whenever I'm playing that different type of worker. I think the only one that really feels nice are the purple possessed workers because they're really, really strong. And so if they could find ways to make that feel more unique, that would be awesome. I also think the maps are pretty much worthless. Now, maps in this game are used whenever you explore a new hex and you gain them to your mech mat, and then ultimately there is an objective for collecting 5 of these maps. But after that, they're dead. You don't use them for endgame scoring. You can't trade them out for anything except for one character. One character is able to use maps to change into money, power, or guile, which I think that's really, really fun. But for all the other players, it's straight up just a dead resource. I think if they could maybe find a way to utilize them in some way, for example, maybe exchange 4 maps to take an action of a previously explored hex, for example. Doing something like that would make it feel better than just having a big pile of maps and they don't do anything. And then a final nitpick is some of the readability on the cards isn't very good. There is a lot of different text that's going all different directions on the cards, so it feels a little busy. And in a large player game, like a 4-player game, literally every single card that I was dealing out, people had to grab, figure out what it said, and that was it was a minor annoyance. It wasn't bad, but if they could, in future editions, make this font bigger somehow, that would definitely mitigate that con for me. Now, all in all, I had a really, really good time with Expeditions. There were a few issues I had with the game, specifically regarding the theming, as well as some of the underutilized resources and the cost, but I do think the pros outweigh the cons. I really love all of the mechanisms in this game, and I think there's a lot of replayability, as well as the game's very accessible for what it is. And for all of those reasons, I'm giving Expeditions an 8.5 out of 10. And if you're like me and your tastes overlap with mine, I think you'll really enjoy this game as well. And that wraps up my review of Expeditions by Jamie Stegmaier. If you thought this review sucked, feel free to roast me in the comments. But if you liked it, give me a like and a subscribe. This is Jordan here at Totally Bored. We'll see you next time.